Hey, welcome back. Today we are looking at Beowulf, and we are talking about the section after the death of Grendel's mother, in which we hear a sermon from Hrothgar and have a journey home to see Hygelac. And while that may not sound like the most action-packed part of the book, it is the part that most directly deals with the overall themes of the story. What it takes to be a good king. When we last left off, Beowulf had crawled out of the stinking pool where he killed Grendel's mother, and he hauled with him the giant head of Grendel, as well as that giant hilt of the magic sword that melted, and of course, the rest of his armor and Hrunting, the sword that Unferth had lent him. And he and his friends begin to travel back to Heorot to show all this off to Hrothgar. They arrive and show off the head, everyone's very impressed, but the real attention is focused on the giant magic sword. Beowulf gives the recap of the events that happened at the bottom of the lake, and points out, as usual, the providence that the Lord allowed him to see just in time this giant sword. After all, Hrunting wasn't doing the job. And we have this moment where Hrothgar examines this giant sword hilt. It says, "It was engraved all over and showed how war first came into the world, and the flood destroyed the tribe of giants. They suffered a terrible severance from the Lord. The Almighty made the waters rise, drowned them in a deluge for retribution. The pure gold inlay on the sword guards were the rune markings correctly incised, stating and recording for whom the sword had been made first, and ornamented with its scroll-worked hilt." So it tells the story of a flood killing the giants and how war began on Earth. This is clearly a reference in the Christian poet's mind to the flood of Noah. And the giants are probably the Nephilim, strange race of powerful but evil giants in the book of Genesis. And we see that overall sense of evil challenging God and his order, and how it is ultimately destroyed, which seems to parallel the family of Grendel. And at this point, instead of simply praising Beowulf, Hrothgar begins a very significant speech in which he argues about how to be a good leader. In short, he sees the trajectory that Beowulf is on. Beowulf is more and more heroic every day, he's done bigger and more impressive things, and Hrothgar correctly foreshadows that Beowulf will become king someday, in spite of the fact that he's not directly in line to do so. "Forever you will be your people's mainstay, and your own warrior's helping hand." At this point, Hrothgar goes on to make two major points in his speech, and each one is coupled with an example. He starts with the story of Heorot, who we mentioned once before in the first Shope song. Heorot was a king who went wrong. He was one of those Rekka, the outcasts who become a hero, but ultimately towards the end of his life, it appears that he became very corrupt. He became selfish and greedy, hoarding the gold for himself and taking out his anger on his own men. The stories we have of Heorot are mostly references within Beowulf and other texts, but Heorot would have been a character very familiar to the audience of the original poem. And the moral of the Heorot story is to avoid that greed and selfishness which leads you to become a bad, wicked ruler. So learn from this and understand true values. I who tell you have wintered into wisdom. At this point, Hrothgar turns to himself as the second example. But he doesn't even use himself as a positive example. Although Hrothgar is a good king, and the book over and over again emphasizes that was a good king when speaking of Hrothgar, he did succumb to one particular problem of leadership, and that is when. Chickering in his book talks about the when, that overweening pride that leads to unexpected consequences. Just when you think you have absolute control of your life, life hits you in an unexpected way. Beowulf has not been showing that kind of pride. Certainly he's very confident in his own abilities, with good reason, but he's also recognized again and again and again the role of providence and the role of weird. He knows that fate is out there, and when it's his time, it's his time. He also knows that God has a hand in everything, and whenever God is ready to take him, that's the right time. Therefore, when things come in the future which he cannot control, at least they don't hit him unexpectedly. Therefore, he can overcome the problem of when. Hrothgar describes this, saying, "It is a great wonder how Almighty God in his magnificence favors our race with rank and scope and the gift of wisdom. His sway is wide. Sometimes he allows the mind of a man of distinguished birth to follow its bent, grants him fulfillment and felicity on earth, and forts to command in his own country. He permits him to lord it in many lands, until the man in his unthinkingness forgets that it will ever end for him. He indulges his desires. Illness and old age mean nothing to him. His mind is untroubled by envy or malice or the thought of enemies with their hate-honed swords. The whole world conforms to his will. He is kept from the worst until an element of overweening enters him and takes hold, while the soul's guard, its century drowses, grown too distracted. A killer stalks him, an archer who draws a deadly bow. And then the man is hit in the heart. The arrow flies beneath his defenses. The devious promptings of the demon start. His old possessions seem paltry to him now. He covets and resents, dishonors customs and bestows no gold, and because of good things that the heavenly powers gave him in the past, he ignores the shape of things to come. Then finally the end arrives when his body he was lent collapses and falls prey to its death. Ancestral possessions and the goods he hoarded are inherited by another who lets them go with a liberal hand. O flower of warriors, beware of that trap. Choose, dear Beowulf, the better part, eternal rewards. Do not give way to pride. For a brief while your strength is in bloom, but it fades quickly, and soon there will follow illness, or the sword to lay you low, or sudden fire, or surge of water, or jabbing blade or javelin from the air, or repellent age. Your piercing eye will dim and darken, and death will arrive, dear warrior, to sweep you away. Just so I ruled the King Dane's country for 50 years, defended them in wartime with spear and sword against constant assaults by many tribes. I came to believe my enemies had faded from the face of the earth. Still, what happened was a hard reversal from bliss to grief. Grendel struck after lying in wait. In Maria Devana Headley's recent translation, she has this wonderful introduction where she talks about the role of kings within this book. How this book is all about holding on to your position as a leader. Over and over again in the book, it repeats the line, that was one good king. About Shield Chieftain, about Hrothgar, about Higelac, about Beowulf. And yet there's always this ominous sense of weird, of doom, lurking in the background, getting ready to rip you down as a leader. How do you stay a good king? How do you hold on to your leadership? Hrothgar says, first of all, you can't let yourself crumble into selfish greed. Second of all, you have to be on the watch for your win, for that pride that will keep you from expecting the unexpected. Of course, even if you're ready, the end still comes. Nothing can stave it off in the end. Doom always happens. But if you want to be a good ruler, you have to be mindful of those things. They have one more feast. Beowulf begins the process of saying goodbye. He gives fronting back to Unferth, even though it didn't do any good. And they prepare to head out, and Beowulf says his goodbye. He pledges his loyalty to Hrothgar, saying, if you ever need me, I will be right back here. And I know Higelac, my king, would be happy to come serve as well. Or if your son is ever out and about, feel free to send him on over to the Geats. We're happy to have friendship between the two of us. Hrothgar also reaffirms this, saying, our tribes have had rough patches in the past, but this has really sealed our friendship. It gives me a lot of hope. My liking for you deepens with time, dear Beowulf. What you have done is to draw two peoples, the Geat nation and us neighboring Danes, into shared peace and a pact of friendship, in spite of hatreds we have harbored in the past. For as long as I rule this far-flung land, treasures will change hands, and each side will treat the other with gifts. And then we have another big round of gifts where Beowulf gets 12 more great presents, and they're all kind of fantastic, and they embrace, and it's a big, happy goodbye. With a little bit of weird lurking over the back in the sense that Hrothgar feels he'll never see Beowulf again. As they're heading down to the beach saying goodbye to all the Danes, they see the old Coast Guard guy from before, the Sea Watchman, and they wave to him, and Beowulf gives him a sword. Again, showing Beowulf as the kind of noble leader who is generous. And on they return to Geatland, where they're going to see King Higelac again, and we're going to get to meet Higelac for the first time. And we also reference Higelac's wife, Queen Hygd, and it describes her. Again, she's another one of these Peace Weaver queens. The building was magnificent, the king majestic, ensconced in his hall, and although Hygd, his queen, was young, a few short years at court, her mind was thoughtful, and her manners sure. Heorot's daughter behaved generously and stinted nothing when she distributed bounty to the Geats. After this short introduction to Queen Hygd, we jump all of a sudden to an aside, a reference to a queen whose name is Queen Modthrith. And Queen Modthrith is very different from Queen Hygd, because instead of thinking of others and that generosity and hospitality which are so valuable to our queens in this book, Wealhtheow and Hygd, Queen Modthrith was incredibly prideful. She's a great beauty, but if anyone looked her directly in the face, she would slap them in irons. Notice what it says about Queen Modthrith, and remember what we said about peace weavers in our last episode. Even a queen outstanding in beauty must not overstep like that. A queen should weave peace, not punish the innocent with loss of life for imagined insults. The role of that queen is to create a peaceful union between nations. It's the peace weaver. Queen Modthrith instead feels insulted by the way people look at her, and therefore she reacts to them. She's failing in her role as a peace weaver, a uniter of nations. This side story is probably one, again, well familiar to its original audience, but we don't have a whole lot of details here. She appears to eventually be brought around by her husband, Offa, after they marry, because he is such a generous and good and noble leader. But in contrast, Hygd seems to be good through and through, even in her youth. We're going to talk a little bit more about her next time. Beowulf arrives and steps forward, and Hygelac is so happy to see him, so glad that he's alive. He wasn't sure how this would go, but he's glad to see Beowulf alive and well. And Beowulf begins to tell his story. He goes through and unpacks all the things that have happened to him while he was among the Danes. And so he's going to recap his monster fights, of course. But also there are some important things that he tells to Hygelac. A moment ago, he was pledging basically undying loyalty to... A moment ago in the text, he was pledging basically undying loyalty to Hrothgar. But his true allegiance is really to Hygelac. But we see here Beowulf in another role. He's not just the macho hero that we've seen him to be multiple times, but he's also an ambassador between two nations. And he has that sense of political consciousness that we see in the unpacking of the story. As he talks to his own king, Hygelac, and unpacks what happened to him among the Danes, he's not only going to hit the actual points of detail, the actions that happened, but he's also going to drop political ramifications of things as he goes along. So, for instance, he notes where Hrothgar set him, that he set him with his own sons, and how that bodes well for peace between the two nations. And as he's also describing Wealhtheow, who he references as a peace pledge between nations, she's another one of these peace weavers, he mentions Wealhtheow's daughter, who we didn't really directly see in the earlier section. Her name is Heorot, and she's the one who is supposed to marry Ingild. Now, we've had a few vague references to this upcoming disaster, all the way back when Hrothgar first built Heorot back in our prologue episode. As soon as he'd finished building this shining hall, the book references its future burning, and that's going to come from this particular story. So Heorot is engaged to a man named Ingild of the Heathobards, and she's supposed to be a peace weaver to create peace between these two clans. But Beowulf, again, observing as an outsider, noticing the political possibilities here, does not feel very hopeful about it. This isn't something he would have directly said to Hrothgar, but he's able to say it to his own king Hygelac. Friend of the Shieldings favors her betrothal. The guardian of the kingdom sees good in it and hopes this woman will heal old wounds and grievous feuds. But generally the spear is prompt to retaliate when a prince is killed, no matter how admirable the bride may be. So although he notes that Hrothgar has high hopes of this uniting the Heathobards and the Danes, Beowulf sees this as a potential disaster. No matter how sweet Heorot is, she's not going to be able to smooth over all the wrongs of the past. And then Beowulf begins to sort of imagine the scene that's going to go down. And it feels very much like some of this language here was lifted from another story, from another song about this particular event. Tolkien certainly thinks so. Either that or Beowulf is intensely prophetic because he gets very specific in how he imagines things are going to go down after the wedding between Ingild and Heorot. Basically, what's going to happen is the two clans are going to be together, celebrating and having a good time. The wedding will have united them, and as they're there, the Heathobards will look over and they will see that the Danes are wearing their nicest armor, their nicest weapons. these are really great pieces of armor and weapons that they took in battle when they used to fight the Heathobards. So the Heathobards will notice, hey, isn't that my daddy's sword you're wearing? Isn't that my family's heirloom armor that you took off of Uncle Steve when you killed him in battle? And you can see how that would raise the tensions a bit. And it gets to the point that some old spearman will be noticing these details, and he'll start nudging one of the young hotheads and saying, you see your daddy's sword over there on that guy? You see that? Now, my friend, don't you recognize your father's sword? His favorite weapon, the one he wore when he went out on his war mask to face the Danes on that final day? After Weathelgild died and his men were doomed, the Shieldings quickly claimed the field. And now here's a son of one or other of those same killers coming through our hall, overbearing us, mouthing boasts, and rigged in armor that is by right is yours. And so it riles up one of the young hotheads, who finally snaps and slashes out with his sword and kills somebody, and then it all breaks out into violence again. Then, on both sides, the oath-bound lords will break the peace. A passionate hate will build up in Ingild, and love for his bride will falter in him as the feud rankles. This is going to lead to the burning of Heorot, and the ultimate destruction of the Heathobards. The Danes will beat out the Heathobards. But it's going to be another disaster for one of those peace weavers, for Heorot, as Ingild is torn between his love for his new wife and his anger and his hatred towards the Danes as they murder his kinsman. It's going to end in disaster. And it's a romantic, heartbreaking story. Beowulf goes back to his story, however, and tells of the fight with Grendel, of the big celebration afterward and the songs that they sang, of the arrival of Grendel's mother and everything that happened because of that, and then ultimately the second fight that Beowulf experienced and how all of that went. Beowulf has all of his presents from Hrothgar, and he shows them all off, and then he says, "These, King Hygelac, I am happy to present to you as gifts. It is still upon your grace that all favor depends. I have few kinsmen who are close, my king, except for your kind self." And he hands over the armor and the weapons, and he hands over all the horses. And then he turns to Queen Hygd, and to her he presents the beautiful necklace that Wealhtheow had given him, which we already know is linked to a future story about Hygelac's death. And after this presenting of gifts, we come to a kind of close here. And there's a wrapping up of the story. Now, there's one more significant section in the book, but we are coming to the close of the first section, the Danish portion. As we close, the book says, "Thus Beowulf bore himself with valor. He was formidable in battle, yet behaved with honor, and took no advantage, never cut down a comrade who was drunk, kept his temper, and, warrior that he was, watched and controlled his God-sent strength and his outstanding natural powers. He had been poorly regarded for a long time, and was taken by the Geats for less than he was worth, and their lord, too, had never much esteemed him in the mead hall. They firmly believed that he lacked force, that the prince was a weakling, but presently every affront to his deserving was reversed." A really striking moment here, because up to this point we've kind of thought of Beowulf as the most macho man in all of Earth. In fact, that's how he was introduced at the beginning, right? He's got the strength of 30 men in his hands. He's able to, split giant monsters in half. And yet, here we see that actually, among the Geats, nobody really thought that highly of him, at least not until now. Maybe all of the things that he'd done in the past, including, I guess, the swimming match with Brecca, had been done sort of in the heat of youth. He hadn't done anything particularly noble until this fight with Grendel. And here is the beginning of his reversal. Here's the time when he finally steps into his own and shows what kind of man he is. We are rising up to a position of leadership and showing the skills of good leadership. And so because of that, we end this section with Hygelac rewarding him and giving him land of his own and giving him a position of his own. So Beowulf is rising to a position of leadership. And the question is, as we get to this point and begin to think about Beowulf's future, what's that going to look like? We wonder if Beowulf will be able to be the kind of good leader that we hope he will for his future. Or will he succumb to some of those problems that Hrothgar mentioned in his big sermon? Will Beowulf be able to resist the greed and selfishness that comes with power? Will Beowulf be able to escape the overweening pride that ultimately leads him to be taken down by unexpected consequences. Those are things we need to keep an eye on as we go forward. And as this book explores the ideas of what is good leadership, and how does one defend oneself from the uncertainty of the future, to protect one's people, to unite one's people, those are all valuable lessons and worth thinking about, especially as throughout history we are able to look at our own leaders and see how power has warped them and corrupted them, and how a lust for power and for greed and wealth have led to disaster and destruction among the leadership of our own present age. Thanks for watching. Next time we will look at what the future holds for Beowulf as a leader, and what future disasters he will still have to overcome. You can click to subscribe or to watch another video, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.